Boldwood presents The Austrian Bride, written by Helen Parusel and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Ella. Linz, Austria, Saturday the 12th of March, 1938. The tram trundled away from the platform, the wooden carriages mellow gold in the late afternoon sunshine. Ella slowed from her sprint as she watched the tram disappear through the stone arch and down the steep hill. She let out an exasperated sigh. Now she would be late, and she only had herself to blame. He was coming to Linz, the man himself. The town was buzzing with nervous energy. Everyone would be fighting for a good view when he arrived, and what had she been doing? She had been wandering amongst the swathes of snowdrops, dreaming of spring and picnics to come, up here on the Purslingberg. In summer, secretarial school would be over, and she would turn 21. An adult. Her life was opening up like an alpine rose. She had stood in front of the brick house that was her former primary school, reminiscing. From there, she'd looked down on the majestic river Danube, glassy grey, flecked with silver, weaving its way through Linz. The next tram wasn't for another hour. She crossed the track and sped down the steep gravel path that wound down the mountainside. As a child, she'd never had money for the tram and had walked this route twice a day for 5 years. She'd wanted to get a place near the front when he came, but as the bells from the grand church atop the Purslingberg chimed 5 o'clock, she knew the crowds would already be gathered below in the town square. She descended past rustic chalets that clung to the hillside, their flower boxes empty. Spring would soon be here. The flower boxes filled with trailing red geraniums and ivy, and hanging baskets would burst with violet petunias. There were grand white stone villas too, boasting balconies with views over the mighty Danube, the lifeblood of Linz. 30 minutes later, she arrived home, her shoes covered in mud and the hem of her long wool coat soaked through. Home was a small 3-story apartment block adorned with window shutters and flower boxes. The rich smell of goulash greeted her as she opened the front door, but she would have to eat later, for her parents stood waiting in the hallway, wearing coats, hats, and grim expressions. "Where on earth have you been?" said her father. "Sorry, Fati," Alice said, grabbing her beret off the hook on the wall and linking her arm in her mother's. "Let's go." It was already dark as they crossed the Donaubrücke over the Danube and approached the town centre. Ella's father strode ahead. She turned to her mother. "I don't know why Fati is so bothered to be here. He doesn't even like the man. It's all about appearances, I suppose." Before her mother could answer, a roar of voices rose into the cold air. She and her parents joined the back of the huge crowd that filled the Hauptplatz. Spotlights had been positioned to light up the crowds, their faces spectre-white under the harsh glow. She could feel the static of excitement all around, an energy that pulsed through her. The message was being passed back through the crowd. The motorcade was arriving. She could see the expectation and hope on the many tired faces. After years of unemployment and food shortages, the prospect of change was intoxicating. She noticed others, too, with dubious expressions, who hung back from the seething masses, but they were the minority. It was hard to tell how many Austrians who opposed the Nazi Party had stayed at home. The Nazi supporters were highly visible with their red armbands displaying the black swastika. Officials were animating the crowd, and photographers jostled for position. "They're putting up a good show for the newspapers tomorrow," said her father, his expression grim. Ella stood on the tips of her toes, straining to see. A shout went up. "He's here!" The crowd pumped their right hands as one, and as one mighty voice roared, "Heil Hitler!" Ella looked to her parents and followed their lead, keeping her right arm pressed against her side, their voices silent. but a part of her wished she could join the euphoria. Until this morning, when the Austrian Chancellor had resigned, the Nazi Party had been banned. Everything was changing so rapidly, it was hard to keep up with what was going on. In the centre of the square stood the imposing Baroque Trinity column, its white marble shimmering bright under the spotlights. Atop, the round gold sculpture shone like a sun. People had clambered onto the base of the column, clinging to the saint statues to get a better view. She recognised a face. Maximilian Giesler. Tall, athletic and handsome. Every girl's dream of a boyfriend. He could take his pick from his beautiful admirers, yet he had chosen her. Max was hers. She waved in his direction, but of course he couldn't see her. All faces were now turned to the curved town hall balcony. A flag had been draped from the balcony railing, not the Austrian flag. It rippled in the breeze. "But it's not official, Vati, is it?" Ella said. "We haven't yet voted to be part of Germany." Her father shook his head. "There's no stopping them now." Conflicting emotions coursed through her in a tumult. Max had told her how everything would be better for the Austrians. No longer would they be the poor relations. There would be jobs, new homes and good schools, sport and social clubs, and a thriving culture. But whose culture? Would she be Austrian or German? Looking at the Nazi flag, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was a flurry of movement on the town hall balcony. Officials, their faces urgent, calling instructions to each other. A standing spotlight was adjusted. An SS officer in black uniform marched out. He checked around him and then raised his hand. The officials stepped aside. And out he walked. Reichskanzler Herr Adolf Hitler. There, on the town hall balcony. Ella gasped. The cheer that went up was deafening. It went on and on. She was transported up on a wave of elation and hope, and without realising what she was doing, she cheered and cheered. Life would get better now. Everything would be fine. Ella inhaled the deep, rich smell of coffee infused with the sweetness of freshly baked cake. Max had brought her to the prestigious Leopold Café on the Linzer Landstrasse. They sat opposite each other at a round, polished wooden table. The waitress, in a black dress and white apron, arrived. She held a silver tray and served them Viennese coffee and Linzer Torte. Ella had a swirl of whipped cream with her cake. Max had none. Max took a sip of coffee and smiled at her. "This will be an important summer for you, Schatz. You'll finish secretarial school, start work, officially become an adult. We shall celebrate your birthday in style. In fact, there is so much to celebrate right now. After the referendum in 2 weeks, the Anschluss will be official, and Austria will become part of the Third Reich." "What I don't understand is, if we haven't voted yet, then why is the German Wehrmacht here? We also have a new mayor, and the German flags are everywhere." "You saw the jubilant reception Hitler received when he arrived in Linz, and in Vienna the crowd went crazy. Women threw flowers. That's why Hitler declared the annexation. He knows what the Austrians want, and that the referendum is a foregone conclusion." "You're right. It does seem that way." Ella sliced her fork into the golden latticed pastry and popped a piece in her mouth. "Hopefully, it will be easier for me to find a job. And maybe there will be more work for Vati, for everyone. Things have been so dire." Max leaned forward and took her hand. She looked at him. His blue-grey eyes, blonde hair and broad chin. He reminded her of a Greek god she saw in a film once. "There will be changes in Linz. You know the Führer went to school here and has fond memories of his teenage years. He loves this town and plans to make it as great as Vienna." Ella laughed. "Oh, Max, don't exaggerate." But although she was laughing, she wanted him to be right. For years, she'd seen ragged children begging in the street, and men wounded in the Great War, limbs missing, sitting on the ground with upturned caps, collecting coins. It was heartbreaking. Things had to change. She wanted her parents not to struggle over every groschen. She wanted to have a job, earn money, and really start her life. Thinking of the possibilities, her heart lifted. She savoured the last piece of her Linzer Torte and beamed at Max. Max picked up her coat and held it as she slipped it on. As they left the cafe, she allowed herself a moment of pride when heads turned, although she knew the glances were more at him than her. It had turned cold again, and a flurry of snow fell from a white-grey sky. Outside stood a group of men holding up placards. Freies Österreich. Most people passed by, averting their eyes, but a man and a woman had stopped to talk to the group, quietly protesting for a free Austria. 2 police cars suddenly appeared, rumbling over the cobblestones, and screeched to a halt. The police jumped out, batons held high. They were from the new force that had recently taken over and was now under fascist command. An officer pointed his pistol at the group. "You're all under arrest." He nodded at his men. "Handcuffs." A protester yelled, "We live in a democracy. We have the right to protest peacefully." There were grunts of agreements from the bystanders. Max tugged Ella's arm. "Let's step back into the cafe." There was a scuffle and a shout, and suddenly the police were clubbing the protesters to the ground, kicking them with their heavy boots. The man and woman who had stopped to talk tried to retreat, but they too were caught up in the scramble. Ella heard the woman cry, "But we weren't protesting!" A policeman grabbed her arm and tried to handcuff her, but she struggled. The man shouted, "Leave her alone!" but he was soon silenced by a club that smashed into the side of his face. He crumpled onto the cobblestones. Ella was rooted to the spot, horrified by what she saw, but too stunned to turn away. She bolted down the street, her heels clicking on the stones as she ran. Her hat flew off, freeing a wave of auburn hair that fell down the back of her camel coat. "Halt!" an officer shouted. The woman ran on. A shot rang out. She dropped face down onto the ground. Ella screamed. Max pulled her towards the cafe. As she followed him, she glanced back to see the woman's camel coat erupting in liquid, glistening red. As Ella and her best friend Heidi crossed the iron Donnerbrücke on their way home from town, the moody Danube was steel grey. A raw wind whipped off the water, and the girls linked arms, huddling into each other for warmth as they strode along. "I can't get the picture of that poor woman out of my head," said Ella. "At night I can see her running in her heels, and her hat flying off, and the blood." "It's terrible. Do you know who she was?" asked Heidi. "That's the strange thing. Nobody knows anything. I scoured the local newspapers, but there's nothing. I have no idea. Why did they shoot her?" "What does Max say about it?" "He says it's an unfortunate, isolated incident. He's sure the officer will be suspended and investigated, but he said we must distance ourselves from those against the Nazi Party." They reached the end of the bridge and made their way into the Urfahrer district where they lived. Heidi lowered her voice as they passed 3 men in black overcoats. "Neighbours in our block were arrested last night. They were supporters of the Communist Party. My father says it's dangerous to express any left-wing views right now." "I don't know what to think. Max keeps telling me everything will work out. We just have to wait till things settle down after the referendum." "How are things with you and Max?" "He was so sweet after the shooting. I was still shaking an hour later. At home, he made me a hot water bottle and tucked me in with a blanket on the sofa." "I think you might be a little in love," said Heidi, a smile in her voice. "I think I might be. A little," Ella replied, her heart beating fast. Chapter 2. Marlene. Marlene flipped the feather quilt off her body and turned onto her back, taking deep breaths. It had been like this every night recently. The heat started in her pelvis, rising swiftly to her chest and spread to her face till her cheeks were burning. Drops of sweat prickled beneath her arms and breasts. Franz lay snoring softly next to her. Marlene sighed. Her husband never had problems sleeping. This fact made her angry, then tearful. As the heat subsided, she got up and stomped out of the bedroom. Her daughter needed her sleep. She had secretarial school tomorrow and was still recovering from that terrible scene she'd witnessed. Marlene went to the small alcove off the kitchen which served as their bathroom. She filled the sink, stripped off her damp nightdress, and, taking an old stiff flannel, washed herself down. Why did she feel so low all the time? Of course there were things to be miserable about, but weren't there always? That was life. She should pull herself together. Her days were too busy to mull around in the doldrums, and she had much to be thankful for. 2 wonderful children. Freddie, studying in Vienna, and Ella, completing her training and becoming a young woman. Marlene had asked advice from Rosa, an older lady who lived upstairs. Rosa had shrugged, saying she'd been too busy raising a family to think about those problems, but advised drinking sage tea for the night sweats. Marlene had started drinking copious amounts of the stuff, but the only effect was that she needed to go to the toilet so often that her sleep was disrupted further. In desperation, she had visited her doctor. He'd said her symptoms were all in the mind, and she should start a new hobby. She dried herself with a towel and slipped her nightdress back on. As she crept past Ella's bedroom, she heard whimpering. Ella was having a nightmare. No wonder, after that awful shooting. Marlene climbed into the bed and wrapped her arms around her, soothing her until she quietened. Marlene pictured herself at a similar age, a couple of years younger, sitting in the sun-filled Biergarten on a narrow bench squeezed between 2 boys. One of the boys put a hand on her knee and began to push it under her dirndl. She felt his warm palm on her skin and giggled. After a moment, she shoved his hand away. She glanced at the boy on the other side of her. He was staring, his pale blue eyes steel hard. Marlene forced herself to slow her stride and relax her shoulders as she turned onto the sandy path, allowing herself one casual glance over her shoulder. Ahead, 4 wooden huts huddled on the outskirts of a forest where towering Austrian pines dropped 3-inch-long cones. Her husband's hut was the largest, a good size for a cabinet maker's workshop. The hut next door was derelict, so that was no problem. Another stored timber, but the owner only came twice a week and always at dawn. The smallest hut was used as a workshop by a burly man who repaired ancient farm equipment. They would have to be wary of him. She rapped on the door, calling softly. Franz appeared and beckoned her inside. Various items of furniture stood around, a sideboard, a coffee table, several kitchen cupboards, and a drink, the latter being a special commission from a wealthy family on the Brucknerstrasse. It was the only work Franz had received in months. Her husband leaned over his workbench. "It's safe, Willi," he said. A thin, frightened man arose from behind the workbench where he'd been crouching. Marlene hugged him. "What happened?" Willi shrugged his bony shoulders. "What's happening everywhere? A friend becomes a collaborator and betrays you to the Nazis. The Gestapo were after me because of the socialist meetings I've held in the past. They're not tolerating any opposing politics." "We'll take care of everything." Franz gripped his arm. "I can't thank you enough." "It's my headstrong wife you have to thank," he said, nodding at Marlene with affection. "She's in charge." "Don't worry, Willie, we can get you into France," she said, sounding more confident than she felt. She pulled a packet from her handbag and laid it on the worktop. "I brought you both something to eat." Franz kissed her cheek and took her hand. "Let me show you something," he said, leading her across to a large oak wardrobe against the back wall of the hut. He turned the small brass key in the lock and opened both doors. Marlene peered into the empty space, breathing in the earthy scent of the wood. She turned to him and frowned. Franz removed a small chisel from his work overalls and wedged it between a spot where the floor met the wall. With a flick of his wrist, he prized the wooden floor up and open. Beneath was a shallow space large enough to hide an adult. Marlene gasped. "That's brilliant." "Only to be used in an emergency," said Franz. "I've drilled air holes in the corners." Marlene suppressed a shudder. "A coffin, but one that could save your life." Chapter 3. Ella. The manager of the Phoenix Cinema stood in the foyer, saying goodbye to the guests and wishing everyone a good evening. Ella smiled at him, but Max ignored him as they left. Once outside the building, Max said, "That manager will soon lose his job. He's a Jew." Ella thought that was a shame. She liked the man, but she said nothing. They stopped on the Donaubrücke and looked through the iron latticework out over the Danube. A gentle swell of black velvet. It was a clear night, and speckles of stars were reflected in the water below them. Max took her hand. Such a romantic moment. Maybe he would kiss her, right here in the middle of the bridge in front of the crowds returning from a night out in town. "You're cold," he said when she gave a slight shiver. "Let's head home." "No, I'm not." It was a stupid thought, that he would kiss her in public. Inappropriate. It wasn't in his nature to behave like that. Ella felt the vibrations under her feet before the clang of the bell drove everyone from the tram lines to the sides of the bridge. The tram clattered past on its way to the Urfahr district. The crowds closed in again along the tracks. When they reached the riverbank on the other side, Max stopped to light a cigarette. After a few puffs, he said, "The newsreel before the film was interesting, don't you think?" It was much longer than usual, wasn't it? Ella gazed across the black water at the twinkle of town lights on the opposite bank. The Linz skyline was defined by an assortment of proud church towers and onion-shaped domes. He looked sideways at her. "That's because there's a lot of important information for us to understand before the vote next week. We must appreciate the incredible benefits of the unification. The vote will cement the Führer's decision to unite Austria with Germany." Ella's father had used different words to describe what Max spoke of. Invade Austria. But Ella knew better than to say anything. "Yes, it all sounds very good," she said, fighting back the image of the woman in the camel coat face down on the street. Max laughed. "Just good? You're not very political, are you? But that's all right for a woman." His words were like little spikes. "Are your parents interested in politics?" He threw his cigarette down on the pebbles and stubbed it out with his heel. "Not really." She made her voice sound dull, uninterested. She wanted to avoid discussing her parents' opposing views with Max. "I'm boring you. Enough of such talk. Let's think about what we're going to do at the weekend." As usual, Max walked her to the entrance of her small apartment block, where he would give her a chaste kiss on the mouth, lips closed. A lantern hung over the entrance, but today, for some reason, it wasn't lit. It felt different, saying goodnight in the dark. Exciting. Her heart quickened as she lifted her face to his. They had been dating 7 weeks and 4 days. She longed for a proper kiss. She was grateful for his gentlemanly behavior, but his lips were on her, pressing lightly on her mouth. She couldn't help herself. Her lips parted. She felt his brief hesitation, then their tongues were touching. She leaned her head back, allowing him to push further into her mouth. His hands were on her shoulders. Maybe he would lower a hand to her breast, touch her through her coat. He pulled back and straightened his hat. "Sorry, Ella, I got carried away." "No, it's fine. Really?" she said, cringing at how breathless she sounded. "I like you very much. You'll be 21 soon. We should wait till then." Ella wished she could see his eyes, but she could only just make out his features in the dark, and now he'd tipped his hat forwards so she could see even less. "I'll call you." And with that, he turned and left. Up in her room, Ella stood by her window. From here she could see Linz's landmark, the Pöstlingberg. On top stood the twin-towered church. Its white stone facade, an ethereal glow beneath a startling clear sky. She thought about what Max had meant by waiting till her birthday. Different scenarios tumbled through her head. As she looked at the church, she wondered what the nuns would think if they could read her mind. She had been brought up a good Catholic girl. Just once she had strayed, a one-night stand in a car after a dance. The sex had been quite unspectacular, but at least she'd impressed Heidi when she'd said, "I did it." Then she thought about the kiss she had just shared with Max. No, she decided, she didn't care what the nuns thought. It was a few days after the Germans had arrived that Ella passed the department store on the Landstrasse and stopped in surprise at the entrance. The door was closed, the lights off. A poster was plastered across the door. Juden raus. Geschlossen. It had only been a couple of weeks since she had shopped there with Mutti. Herr Pissinger had been standing in front of his department store window with a bucket and large sponge, scrubbing furiously at the glass. "Grüß Gott," said Ella and her mother in unison as they approached. Ella was surprised that his normally cheerful greeting was a mere mumble. As they passed him to enter the shop, Ella noticed the red-painted letters scrawled across the glass. Ella exchanged a look with her mother. How could people be so hateful? Just because the Pissingers were Jewish, their family had lived in Austria for generations. Mutti gave the tiniest shake of her head. "Don't say anything. Be careful," it said. At the front of the store, customers were greeted by polished wooden cabinets that displayed a fan of silk scarves and long white gloves behind the sparkling glass. A sales assistant greeted them and offered them to try the new scent from Chanel. They proffered their wrists and wafted away in a floral mist towards the dress department. Ella gestured to a mannequin on a square wooden platform which displayed a dress for springtime, a fitted navy and cream-spotted dress with a round collar and puffed sleeves. "That's very smart, Mutti," she said. "It would suit you." "Maybe, but today I've saved up for it. After all, 21 is a special occasion." They milled around the racks, exclaiming at each lovely dress they found and showing them to each other. "Hello, ladies." It was Jeden Pissinger, the eldest son of the family. He had just returned from studying at the Business Academy in Vienna and was being trained to take over the store one day. Ella had known him since childhood. He asked how they were and if he could be of assistance. "I'm looking for a dress for my 21st, Ella said proudly. "My goodness, when did that happen? Suddenly an adult." His black hair had grown longer and was starting to curl at the ends, she noticed. He'd lost weight since he'd been in Vienna, his face more angular. "How's Ruth?" she asked. The name caught in her throat. Ella had envied Ruth in the past. "She's well, thank you. She's visiting her mother in Salzburg. Actually," he paused and gave a broad smile. "We've just got engaged." Marlena exclaimed in joy and offered her congratulations. Ella gave a false laugh. "About time. You've been together for years." She had been sweet on Jeden when she was about 12 years old and used to browse around the store after school hoping to see him. But when he did appear, she couldn't string a sentence together and always berated herself afterwards for being the most boring girl on earth. At first, when Jeden and Ruth started dating, she was bereft. Ruth sparkled and chattered and bounced as she walked. Ella was both in awe and jealous of her. Time went by and the two had remained inseparable, yet Jeden seemed to notice Ella's adoration and had flirted with her on occasion. Once he had given her a swift, playful kiss on her cheek, and Ella had never forgotten it. Nevertheless, she'd moved on and started to notice other boys. And then came Max. Ella tried on some dresses whilst her mother sat on an upholstered stool outside the changing room. One of the times she parted the velvet curtains to show her mother a sky-blue dress with matching short-sleeved jacket, Jeden had passed by and had said, "Beautiful." Had he meant her or the dress? Now she stared at the closed door of the store, unable to believe this had happened to Jeden and his family. She was aware, of course, of the rise of anti-Jewish feeling, but that the Nazis would close businesses just days after the annexation was shocking. Where was Jeden now? She started to bite her nails, feeling confused and guilty. She had been excited when Hitler arrived. Max had said things would improve now. She needed... Chapter 4. Marlene. The sun was shining when Marlene joined the queue outside the town hall. It was the 10th of April, the day Austrians would decide to be absorbed into the Deutsche Reich or not. France had stayed at home, refusing to vote, saying the whole thing was a farce and that the result would be manipulated. Marlene looked up at the huge portrait of Adolf Hitler that already hung over the door of the town hall. The blaze of red and black swastikas assaulted her from every direction. Posters blared, declaring work for everyone, and banners hung from balconies were emblazoned with the words, Ja, dein Führer. Citizens were bombarded with the message, Yes to Hitler. On her way to the Hauptplatz, she had passed German food trucks giving out baskets of food. No one shall go hungry under the Führer, shouted the soldiers as they handed out their bribes to the public. Could people be bought so easily? Marlene hoped not, but her stomach was in knots as she fought back a sense of hopelessness. The air began to thrum. People craned their necks as German planes, the Luftwaffe, swept over Linz, demonstrating their prowess, and headed east towards Vienna. Marlene wondered if this air display was meant to impress or intimidate. Both, she decided. Everyone had turned out in their best clothes to vote. Marlene had chosen her charcoal grey wool coat and black felt hat. She had powdered her face and applied rose-coloured lipstick. Excited chatter surrounded her as the queue edged forward. If they bring jobs and put food on the table, then that must be good, surely. I don't agree with everything they're doing, but politics is never perfect, is it? A young, slim man spoke. His older companion replied, The immigrants are the problem. All these Jews taking our jobs and getting rich. An elderly woman turned round. Well, I, for one, am grateful for what Jewish families have brought this town. Department stores and shops. And what about the leather glove factory? They all gave jobs to locals. And my doctor, a kind, good man, is a Jew who... She snapped her mouth shut as a German soldier and an SS officer appeared, surveying the queue. That's the problem, thought Marlene. People might not agree with the NS party, but they were too scared to speak out. At least they could protest with their cross on the ballot paper. The queue moved out of the bright sunlight into the dim corridor of the town hall. Marlene was momentarily blinded until her eyes adjusted. The smell of stale cigars and sweet perfume. An official was directing people through a doorway to her right, and when she passed through, she found herself in a crowded room, the walls plastered with Nazi slogans. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one Reich, one leader. We support mothers and children. We build homes. And placards all around the room with the word Ja written boldly in red. Marlene's head swam. She looked up at the photograph of Hitler framed with flowers. His thin hair parted to the right, stern eyes and a small moustache over a small, tight mouth. He would be nearly 50 now, she thought, just 1 year older than her. And as she stared at his face, she saw him, 17 years old, looking at her across the crowded Edelweiss Cafe. He's an angry-looking man. Marlene recognized the voice in her ear and turned round. It was Frau Eckel from the bakery. But what should we do? The woman looked over her shoulder and added quietly, They're already here now. We don't want any fighting. We must think of our sons. An official ushered them along to a line of tables where Marlene gave her name to a man in a three-piece suit. He gave her a ballot paper and signalled to a low screen where an armed German soldier stood on either side. An SS officer in black beckoned her forwards. The silver skull emblem pinned to his collar glinted in a shaft of sunlight. Her legs went weak. Boneless. The room was too hot. The SS officer frowned and motioned to her to hurry up. She stumbled around the screen, where a tall table stood with a pen on a string. She stood, looking left and right at the profiles of the soldiers. Hands shaking, she placed the ballot paper on the table. There were few words. Did she agree with the decree, March 13th, to the unification of Austria with the German Reich? Marlene nearly laughed out loud. There were 2 circles where you could place your cross. In the middle of the ballot was a large circle labelled Ja, and to the right, a tiny circle labelled 9. She picked up her pen and hovered over the small circle. We must think of our sons. Freddie, in Vienna, just 21 years old, always so hot-headed, getting into arguments over injustices. Her husband, Franz, over 50, not as fit as he used to be. She had put him in danger, persuading him to help Willi. They had got him away, but there were others needing help now. And she had to protect Ella, too, who didn't know what they were up to. His face expressionless. He couldn't see the ballot paper, but would he be able to judge where she placed her cross? She would then have to walk past him to the ballot box that stood in front of the screen. And what about the SS officer? What if he shouted, "Halt!" and demanded to see her vote? No, she would not be intimidated. She was entitled to free speech. Thankfully, the soldier looked away. Her hand jittered. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was too dry. She saw those eyes of ice, the scorn in that pinched mouth, the anger within. She placed her cross. It was bad enough that she dreamt about that night on the bridge all those years ago, but now the memory occupied Marlene during the day. Images of her young self, distraught and soaking wet from the driving rain, battling the wind as she crossed the angry Danube. The shrill whistle of the kettle jarred Marlene from her thoughts of the past and back into her kitchen. Her body felt heavy and cumbersome as she took the kettle from the stove and poured the boiling water over the sage leaves. She then shuffled in her worn-out slippers into the sitting room and sat in the armchair by the window. The net curtains needed washing, she noticed vaguely, as she placed the mug on the side table. She wouldn't drink the tea. She didn't like the taste, just the ritual of making it. She had been angry with Franz for staying at home on the day of the referendum last week, for wasting his vote. He'd argued that by abstaining, he had made his views clear. She hadn't agreed and had marched out purposefully to the Rathaus. And what had she done? Weakened in the face of the Nazi uniforms, stern faces of the SS, the posters and banners screaming at her. She had crumpled at the sight of Linz turned blood-red in swastikas. Overwhelmed with raw fear, she'd placed her cross in the box that went against her beliefs and principles. She'd been too ashamed to tell Franz what she'd done. How ironic that she was brave enough to aid someone hunted by the Nazis, but not brave enough to vote against them. On the armrest lay the sketchbook with her designs for printed scarves. She enjoyed working at the small textile factory. The people there were like her second family. An image popped into her mind, and she started to sketch. Clusters of edelweiss, so perfect for a neck scarf. She drew until the page was full of the tiny star-shaped mountain flowers. Then she turned the page and started again. Page after page, she drew the national symbol of Austria until her fingers cramped. This scarf would never be printed, of course, but she could imagine one that would be. Covered in giant birds, black eagle. Tears ran down her cheeks and dropped onto her drawings, smudging the lines and softening the paper. Chapter 5. Ella. The place to meet was the Klosterhof Biergarten, a large cobbled courtyard beneath a sprawling canopy of chestnut trees. Lanterns stood between the wooden tables, enabling people to drink their Weissbier and eat brezeln late into the evening. Teenagers met in large groups and drank homemade ginger beer and shared a bratwurst. Ella had been delighted and grateful when Fatih had offered to book a celebration there for her birthday. She knew he had to watch his money. He was a self-employed cabinet maker, and his income was irregular. 1 month he would receive a commission from a wealthy family on the Stockbauernstrasse to build a complete library. Another month, there would be nothing. The middle of May was the perfect time to have a birthday. Spring was in full bloom, and the weather was nearly always warm. Today was no exception. Ella walked with her guests through the small stone archway on the Landstrasse that opened into the courtyard, which had been previously a cloister garden. Max linked his arm in hers and smiled.
I know I keep saying it, but you look beautiful.
Ella smiled at him. She had chosen the sky-blue dress and jacket, the one Jeden had said was beautiful. That morning, she'd rinsed her hair with vinegar to make her brunette hair shine, which she wore in soft waves to her shoulders. She'd powdered her face and curled her eyelashes, framing her amber eyes. Deciding against lipstick, she'd glossed her lips with a dab of Vaseline. The party was made up of 20 guests, a mixture of family and friends. Older relatives sat on wooden chairs at square tables, whilst the younger ones squeezed side by side on narrow benches at the long trestle tables. The waiters, dressed in short lederhosen and brown and white checked shirts, took their orders. Ella felt blessed to be tucked in between her best friend Heidi and her handsome Max. Even more so that her brother Freddie had travelled from Vienna to celebrate this day with her. He grinned from across the table.
So, my baby sister is an adult now. Are you still thinking of studying in Vienna, just to annoy me?
She laughed. Don't worry, you wouldn't have to babysit me. Anyway, I haven't decided yet. She glanced at Max. When she had mentioned studying, Max had given a short laugh and said, Whatever for? She'd told him she was interested in history and literature.
Let's wait and see,
he'd said. Now he gave a quick smile and squeezed her hand. Her parents were stretched to the limit, supporting Freddie. The waiters arrived with the food, huge platters in each hand. The guests had been given the choice between Sauerbraten and Knödel or Wiener Schnitzel and potato salad. Ella laid her serviette carefully on her lap. She didn't want to get an oily stain on her new dress. The afternoon sped by, the sound of laughter and clinking of glasses filling the air. As dusk seeped into the garden, the lanterns and fairy lights which had been draped through the trees lit up, and the 2 musicians arrived with their accordions. Ella danced with her father, brother, and male cousins, but mostly with Max. He was particularly attentive that evening, and hardly left her side, his arms snug around her waist, or his fingers entwined with hers. She loved the attention. It made her feel special. After the musicians had packed away their instruments, people began to say goodbye and drift off. And when the last of the guests had gone, Ella's parents and Freddie went inside to have a schnapps with the landlord. Max drew Ella to an iron seat beneath a lantern. She thought how smart he looked in his 3-piece suit. She tipped her face towards him for a kiss. He smiled, cupping her cheek with his hand, and pressed his mouth against hers. His cool lips and warm tongue sent a shiver through her. He moved from her mouth to her cheek, and then to her ear before whispering, I have something for you, Liebling. He pulled back, slipped his hand inside his breast pocket, and withdrew a tiny black velvet sack. Her stomach flipped as he opened the palm of her hand and placed it there. He looked at her, his blue-grey eyes intense. What is it? She said, her mouth dry.
Your 21st birthday present. Open it.
She felt as though she was in a film. Her fingers were not a part of her as she pulled on the strings and with great care tipped the bag over her palm. She stared at the gold ring, the small diamond sparkling under the lamplight. Oh, Max,
Please wait. Before you say anything, hear me out.
His words tumbled after each other.
I know this may seem unexpected, and I know we haven't been together long, but the thing is, I can't stop thinking about you. You have captured my heart. I'm simply besotted, and I need to know you are mine. Even if we don't get married for a while, I want everyone to see that you are my girl. Even if you go to Vienna, everyone will know your heart is taken. Maybe you'll decide to stay in Linz and find a job. My father has connections. Maybe I won't have to live through the despair of us being apart.
Max, my darling, I don't know what to say.
Here, just try it on.
He slipped the ring on. It was too big, so she swiveled it in place.
I'll get it made smaller, he said.
Her heart hammered, her thoughts and emotions a tumult in her head. She loved Max, didn't she? But marriage? So soon? She hadn't even met his family yet. They had only kissed once or twice. Max, I'm flattered. No, honoured. No, sorry, that sounds terribly trite. I love you. She slowly removed the ring. But I need time to think about it.
Of course.
His voice was tight as he took back the ring. I would like to meet your parents, she said. Was it her imagination, or did he flinch? He nodded and said,
Of course.
Modest and spotless. That's how her mother would have described the house, thought Ella as she entered the hallway. And Max's mother, Frau Giesler, resembled her house, modest and spotless. She wore a cream blouse buttoned to the neck, her hair wound into a tight bun, and in her ears were tiny pearl earrings. For the occasion, she had powdered her face and applied a trace of blush lipstick. Ella was relieved that she herself had decided on a demure look, no makeup over her tanned face, and a round-necked mid-calf dress. Herr Giesler stood at the window, looking out. He did not turn around when Ella, Max, and his mother entered the sitting room. Frau Giesler spoke in a thin voice. Fräulein Ella has arrived, dear. He turned. He was tall, straight-backed, and good-looking for his years. She imagined Max would look the same at his age. Herr Giesler did not smile.
At last, we get to meet the young woman who has been enticing our son. Maximilian has been very secretive about you.
He gestured to the set table.
Please, take a seat.
Ella's appetite disappeared as she took her place, nerves knotting her stomach. She had been invited to Kaffee und Kuchen. A lace tablecloth covered the round table, and in the centre perched a Topfentorte on an elegant cake stand. As they sat down, Frau Giesler straightened a cake fork and adjusted the handle of a coffee cup. The conversation was polite small talk, mostly initiated by Max's father. How was her training progressing? What sports interests did she have? And what did her father do for a living? Even though the sponge cake filled with cream cheese was light and fluffy, Ella could hardly swallow it. Her throat had tightened from the moment she met Max's imposing father. Max barely said a word, but when his father, he shot her a look. I am looking for a secretarial position in Linz, she answered. Or to study in Vienna. Herr Giesler nodded his approval.
I may be able to help you there. I have connections here in Linz. As I'm sure you know, our vinegar factory is an important business for the town.
He nodded at Max.
A business that Max will one day take over, if he proves himself.
Max looked anything but excited at the prospect. When they had finished their coffee and the conversation dwindled, Max and his father withdrew to the armchairs, and his mother started to clear the table. Ella jumped up to help and followed her into the kitchen, where the two women washed the dishes. Tell me, Ella, are you fond of children? Yes, I am. That's good. Children can be hard work, but there is no greater reward than providing one's husband with a family. I'd like a family, one day. One day? What do you mean by that? Frau Giesler looked up from the soap suds, frowning. I'd like to wait a little while. Wait? Whatever for? It's best to start as young as possible. Are you aware that women of the Reich who bear 4 children for the Führer receive a medal? The Mutterkreuz? Ella wasn't sure how to reply. 4 children sounded alarming. But Frau Giesler continued. As you know, Max has 2 younger brothers at university, twins. It was a difficult birth with some complications. Unfortunately, I was not able to conceive again. Such a disappointment for my husband. And myself, of course. But we are grateful for our wonderful sons. Ella's cue to pay a compliment. You have a wonderful family. She placed the last of the dried plates on the counter. You're young enough to have 6 children, if God blesses you. She looked Ella up and down, like the farmers that eyed the cattle at the market. You are skinny, but you have good hips. Thank you. Ella had a sudden desire to run home. Instead, she followed Frau Giesler back to the men in the sitting room for a further round of stilted and troubling conversation. Chapter 6. Marlene. Marlene heard the shouts before she turned the corner. She hesitated. Loud, aggressive men's voices and a quieter voice pleading, No, please. She ought to turn on her heel and head straight back home and start preparing the knödel for dinner. Danger was around that corner. Grunts and a thumping sound, a whimper and a moan. She couldn't ignore someone. 2 young men in brown shirts wielding sticks were leaning over an elderly man crouched on the ground. Dirty Jew, spat the taller one and smashed his baton down on the old man's shoulder. Stop that! Marlene called out, horrified. The 2 looked up at her in surprise. They were no more than boys, maybe 17 years old. But they were strong, their toned biceps protruding from their short-sleeved shirts. The shorter, broader boy took a step towards her. What are you, a Jew lover? He snarled. Marlene forced herself not to take a step back. And what are you, a hooligan? The old man groaned and tried to get to his feet, but the taller boy kicked him back down. Stay in the gutter where you belong. That's enough. Marlene took a step towards the man lying in the street. The shorter boy pressed his baton across her chest, perspiration on his smooth forehead, eyes lit with excitement. Marlene fixed her gaze on him. I'm old enough to be your mother. I have a son who probably went to the same school as you. What are you going to do? Beat a middle-aged woman? How brave and noble of you. He sneered at her and pressed the baton harder against her. She swallowed and mustered up her most authoritative voice. Let me pass. He didn't move. The power of his arm across her chest did not ease. She swallowed hard and spoke again, louder this time. Let me pass. Now. He glanced at his friend, who gave the slightest nod. The boy lowered the baton and gave a false laugh. Go ahead. We'll find ourselves another rat to play with. The tall boy leaned down and snatched something from the old man's jacket pocket, and the 2 of them sprinted off. Marlene knelt next to the man. He had a cut on his cheek, and blood trickled from his nose. Shall I call a doctor? Let me help you sit up. I have no money for a doctor, he groaned. They took my wallet. The money from the watch I just sold. What will I tell my wife? How shall we pay our rent? His tired eyes brimmed with tears. Let's go to the police, Marlene said, but even as the words came out of her mouth, she knew they were meaningless. The police were all Nazis now. Those police who did not agree with the new regime were dismissed from the force, or arrested, or they disappeared. There was nothing she could do for this man right now, other than help him home. God bless you, he said, his hands trembling as he clasped Marlene's in his. You may have saved my life. She hurried home, shaken by the events of the evening. Those youths had been Austrian boys, bullies with ugly fascist mouths spouting vile hatred. How had Austria become like this? Just a few years ago, the NS party was a minority, and the socialists were fighting for workers' rights. Somehow the poison had set in, sending out its tendrils like cancer that spread and grew into an unrelenting monster. She climbed the path alongside the meadow that led to their home, her dress damp from sweat. How wonderful was nature! It continued its cycle, oblivious of the disaster gripping the country. The wildflowers still bloomed, the bees collected nectar, the grass grew long, hiding the crickets that chirped throughout the summer. Yesterday, she had planted geraniums in the window flower boxes, her yearly ritual. Such rituals made her feel secure, safe. But that was an illusion. How many Linz citizens were active Nazis, and how many opposed the regime but stayed silent and hidden like her and Franz? She wondered about Max. Till recently, he had been the perfect gentleman when collecting Ella for a date or joining them for Sunday lunch. He'd avoided conversations about politics, making polite small talk, complimenting the food, and praising everything about Ella. Marlene had been quite taken with him. Of course, she still had reservations about his father, but that was all long ago now. Outside the apartment block, two of the girls from downstairs were holding the ends of a skipping rope, whilst their sister jumped in the middle. Their childish voices chanted out a rhyme. The main door was open, and Marlene was relieved to pass into the cool hallway. As she climbed the stairs, exhaustion swamped her. In the last few weeks, she had noticed changes in Max. He'd become more vocal in talking about the advantages of Austria being part of the Reich. Excited even. He made angry comments about the communists, or let a snide remark about the Jews slip from his lips. Franz remained stubbornly silent, avoiding confrontation in front of Ella, as had Marlene. But was that the right thing to do? Not to speak up? As she entered the apartment, she was welcomed by the smell of cooking. Ella had started dinner. In the kitchen, the knödel bobbed in the hot water, and pieces of bacon sizzled in a pan. Ella looked up and smiled. "There you are, Mutti. Go and join Fati, and I'll bring the dinner in a moment. Then you can tell us all about your day."
Chapter 7. Ella.
The house stood in a smarter part of town, but it was not as grand. Ella had stopped here several times recently, but had seen no one. She gazed at the white stone facade and varnished wooden shutters with vague, fond memories. A couple of times, when she was young, she had been invited to a party here. She remembered dancing around the garden in a white embroidered dress with a blue velvet belt tied into a large bow. Yaden, thin and tall, had handed her a yellow balloon on a piece of string. She had taken it home with her and kept it in her room until it shriveled into nothing, after which Mutti had disposed of it. As she stood there, Ella felt that same tightness in her chest she'd felt all those years ago when she had come back from school and discovered the balloon was gone. In those days, she hadn't been aware the family was Jewish. It was only later that she began to hear the derogatory comments, and prejudice had certainly increased in recent years. She studied the windows upstairs and saw movement behind the laced net curtains. Suddenly embarrassed at the idea of being caught snooping, she turned away and headed in the direction of the Danube. Walking towards her was Yaden, head down, hands shoved deep in his trouser pockets. He didn't see her till the last moment. He seemed wary, as if he wasn't sure how much she knew and what she thought of recent events. After an uncomfortable silence, she blurted out, "The shop is closed. What's happening?" He sighed and looked away.
"New rules from the authorities. Jews are not allowed to run businesses anymore."
"But why?" She felt stupid as soon as she said it.
"Oh, come on, Ella. Because we're undesirable. And good Austrians should not be buying from us and feeding our undesirable mouths."
She startled at the bitterness in his tone.
"Sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to snap at you."
"It's all right," she said. He was looking up the road, signalling he wanted to end the conversation. "I'm really sorry, Yaden." She put her hand on his arm. He had rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, and her fingers brushed his soft, dark hair. He glanced down in surprise, and she let her arm drop. "This isn't the Austria I wanted." In a quiet voice, he said,
"We're not called Austria anymore. We're called Ostmark."
They fell silent. The summer sounds around her felt louder than usual. Bees and birds, and the call of an ice cream seller. "What will happen to the shop?" she asked.
"They are forcing my father to sell at a ridiculously low price. Every day that he doesn't agree, the price falls further."
Ella fought to find some words that didn't sound futile, but she couldn't, so she just stood there feeling useless. As tears threatened, she too looked up the road, desperate suddenly to be gone. He spared her then and made some excuse about a pressing chore at home and said goodbye. Ella crossed the bridge over the Danube as a cargo boat laden with logs eased down the river to the timber factory. Today the river shone blue and silver, gliding unhurriedly on a windless day. She saw people swimming further downstream where the current was gentler. She could imagine their shrieks as their bodies hit the cold water and the laughter of friends watching from grassy banks sprinkled with daisies. Everything was the same as every summer, and yet nothing was the same. It was the perfect June day that was anything but perfect. They sat in the exact same spot as when he had proposed to her, on the iron seat under the branches of a chestnut tree. Then it had been cool and dark. Tonight it was a warm, light summer's evening. The Klosterhof Biergarten was crowded, and it was now a common sight to see young men in military uniform. Ella could hear the distinct difference in accents, the lilt of the Austrian soldiers mingled with the staccato of the Germans. She found it jarred her nerves. Max touched her cheek.
"What's the matter, Liebling?"
Ella took a deep breath. She had been thinking about what to say all day. If she were even to consider marrying Max, she must speak her mind. Max was skilled in evading certain topics in such a way that she sometimes felt she didn't really know him at all. "I bumped into Jeden Pissinger in town this morning." She saw his jaw tighten. "And he told me they've been ordered to close and sell their store. How can that be allowed to happen?"
Max sighed. "They are Jews, sweetheart."
He spoke in the tone of speaking to a child, and she felt a flicker of anger.
"You know that Jews take jobs from Austrians," Max continued. "They grow rich at others' expense. They are different to us, not of the Germanic race. We don't want them here."
Her chest tightened. She had voted yes to the reunification. The day of the vote had been filled with excitement and optimism. Hand in hand, she and Max had entered the town hall and placed their cross, a cross for a better future, an end to poverty, to children hungry and begging in the streets. She'd simply blocked out any uneasiness about the new Reich and its Führer. "I don't agree with what's happening to the Jewish community."
"You must understand that the Germanic race has to keep together as a community. It has to become strong, stay pure, and reject those who try to poison our society."
Max flushed and looked around him in embarrassment.
"But I don't want to upset you talking about politics."
"But I want to talk about politics, and I want to talk about people. Austrian people and their families who are being hounded. Just because I want a good job doesn't mean I don't care about what happens to others in the process." Ella could hear the shrillness in her voice. She must calm down. A woman had turned to look at her. Max frowned and lowered his voice.
"You are distressed, and this is not the best place to talk about these things. Let's continue this conversation later."
Ella snapped her mouth shut and ground her jaw. She didn't want to argue in public.